I've been carrying this for 41 years, and I figure the time I have left doesn't warrant holding it any longer. My cousin Dale was found on the shoulder of a logging spur above the Fraser Canyon, wrapped in fresh-cut fir boughs, 60 meters from where his truck had gone off the road and down into a creek drainage 30 feet below. His pelvis was fractured. 2 ribs were cracked. The attending physician at Hope Hospital told me plainly that a man with those injuries could not have moved himself across flat ground, let alone up a 30-foot embankment in the dark. Someone, or something, moved him, and I know what it was. I want to be honest with you before I go any further. I'm 71 years old. I spent 33 years doing highway maintenance for the province of BC, most of it along the Coquihalla Corridor and the Fraser Canyon routes. I know that country the way a man knows his own backyard fence line. Every drainage and washout and road cut between Hope and Lytton. I've pulled maybe 30 vehicles out of ditches and creek beds over the years, and I've filled out more incident reports than I care to count. I'm not a man who reaches for impossible explanations. Ruthie, my wife, used to say I was the last person in the world you'd expect to believe in something you couldn't measure with a tape. She wasn't wrong, which is why what I have to tell you has taken me this long to say out loud. Ruthie died in the spring of 2019. Pancreatic cancer, fast and without much mercy. She was 66 years old. In the last week, when she still had the energy to talk, she told me she was releasing me from the promise we'd made together. She said, and I can still hear her voice exactly, "Glenn, when I'm gone, you tell it. You tell it right." So that's what I'm doing. I'm telling it right. But to understand what was found on that road shoulder in October of 1983, I have to take you back to the week before. Dale Graham was 29 years old that fall, same age as me. We'd grown up together, closer to brothers than cousins, on account of our fathers being the kind of brothers who actually kept in touch, who drove 4 hours to see each other at Christmas, and who called on each other's birthdays without having to be reminded. Dale had been working in the camps up near Boston Bar for 2 seasons, running cut for a falling crew that worked the high ground above the canyon. He was a big, square-shouldered man, not tall but solid the way some men are, like the weight is distributed all the way to the floor. He didn't talk much. He laughed harder than anybody when something was funny and went completely quiet when it wasn't. He was good with his hands, and he didn't trust machines he hadn't personally inspected, which is the kind of man who survives in that work. On the 23rd of October, 1983, Dale was driving back from the camp alone, coming down off a spur road that ran above the old No. 3 highway, maybe 12 kilometers northeast of Hope. The spur was a logging access road, gravel over hardpan, cut into the canyon wall and not maintained to any standard that would have helped him. It had been raining for 3 days running. Not the steady coastal rain you get in summer, but October rain, cold enough to sit right at the edge of freezing once you got above a certain elevation, heavy enough to soften every shoulder and every crown, and make the drainage ditches run full and fast. He lost the road on a left-hand curve above the creek drainage. The way the RCMP reconstructed it, the outer edge of the grade had undermined over the course of those 3 wet days, and the right-side wheels dropped through the crust. He went off the road and down. The truck, a blue 1979 Ford half-ton with a toolbox welded to the frame, fell 30 feet and came to rest on its driver's side against the creek bank. The engine was still running when the searchers found it. Dale didn't arrive at the camp in Hope that evening. By 9 o'clock, his crew foreman, a man named Halverson, had called Dale's uncle in Chilliwack. By 10, Halverson had called the Hope RCMP detachment. A constable by the name of Lorne Petch took the call. He was a practical, unflappable man, the kind that BC interior policing produces reliably, and he logged the information and told Halverson they'd begin a vehicle search at first light along Dale's probable route. First light came and went. They found the tyre marks at the road edge around 8 in the morning, the curl of mud where the shoulder had let go, and the broken brush on the slope below. They could see the truck from the road with binoculars, cab down in the creek bed, and they called for a ground team to get down to it. Dale wasn't in it. There was blood on the driver's side window, and the door had been pushed partially open from inside, which told them he'd been conscious at some point after the impact. But there was no trail of disturbance through the brush going anywhere. No crushed ferns, no broken branches low enough for a crawling man to have made, no blood drops leading toward the road. He was simply not there. By the second morning, when the RCMP search had been running for close to 20 hours and had covered the accessible drainage on foot, my Uncle Warren called me. He was a quiet man ordinarily, deliberate in the way that people from that generation of rural BC men tended to be, not given to alarm, and the fact that I could hear his voice unsteady told me everything before he said a word. I drove out from Abbotsford at 4 in the morning, and I was on that hillside by 7 with a borrowed pair of rubber boots and a hand-drawn map of the search sectors Constable Petch had organised. We looked through the second day. The rain had stopped overnight, but it had gone colder down to just above freezing at valley level, which meant it was colder still up on the spur. A man with serious injuries in wet clothes without shelter, on that hillside, in that temperature, through a second night. I knew what that arithmetic added up to. Everybody in those search sectors knew, and nobody said it out loud, but it sat in the air between us the way certain silences do. I want to tell you what my Aunt Clara said to me at the parking pull-out, where we were getting sandwiches at around noon. She said, "He's alive, Glenn. I don't know how and I don't care how, but he is still alive." She said it the way she might have said the weather was turning or that the truck needed fuel. Flat, like a fact. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't asking anyone to agree. She was just stating it because she believed it absolutely and couldn't be bothered pretending she didn't. I didn't argue with her. I knew Dale. He was the kind of stubborn that finds ways to persist when persistence has stopped making any rational sense. But even accounting for that, what I believed privately, standing in that cold October air, was that we were going to find Dale Graham's body at the bottom of that drainage before nightfall. We found him at 2:47 in the afternoon on the 25th of October, 1983. He was lying on the road shoulder on the uphill side of the spur, 60 metres northeast of the point directly above where the truck had come to rest in the creek bed. He was on his back. He was arranged, and I use that word carefully because there is no better one. He was arranged with his head slightly elevated on a folded bed of cut fir boughs, and he was covered with more boughs laid in overlapping rows across his chest and legs, the way you might thatch a roof, the way someone familiar with cold and wet would know to layer something to trap warmth. The boughs were fresh cut, the cuts clean on the stems. There was no cutting tool at the scene. The searcher who reached him first, a man named Arne who worked for the Forest Service, called back to the group, and I heard something in his voice I hadn't expected. Not distress, something quieter than that. I was the second person to reach him. Dale was unconscious but breathing. His lips were blue at the edges. His clothes were wet, but the boughs had kept the direct cold off his core, and the attending paramedic who came up the slope 15 minutes later told us afterward that the insulation had almost certainly made the difference between the temperature Dale's chest registered and the temperature it would have registered without that cover. He used the phrase marginally incompatible with life for what Dale's core temperature would have become without the bough arrangement. He didn't mean it as anything other than a clinical observation. I've thought about that phrase for 41 years. Constable Petch took measurements and photographs before anyone moved Dale for evacuation. He was professional and thorough, and I respected that. He noted the distance from the wreck site, and he noted the bows, and he photographed both. What he wrote in the report, which I read later through a records request in 1986, was that the injured party had been found 60 meters from the wreck in a manner and condition inconsistent with self-evacuation, given documented injuries. The report noted the bow arrangement as field evidence but offered no mechanism for it. Petch was a man who wrote what he could document. He could document the fact. He could not document the explanation. I saw the ground beside Dale before the tape went up. This is important, so I want to be precise about it. The ground on the uphill shoulder of that spur road was soft from the rain, the kind of ground that holds an impression cleanly. I have spent 3 decades looking at ground for exactly this purpose, reading road surfaces and drainage patterns and subsidence, and I know what impression evidence looks like. There were tracks in the soft ground along the road shoulder, bipedal and larger than any human foot I have ever encountered in 33 years of highway work, which puts me in contact with a great many pairs of boots in a great many sizes. The impressions were deep, consistent with significant weight, and the stride pattern was long, longer than the stride of any man I've seen walk. There were 4 clear impressions on the uphill side of where Dale was lying, and 2 more partially preserved ones on the slope below the road edge, as if whatever had been walking there had come up from the drainage side and placed Dale on the shoulder and then moved back down. I stood there looking at those impressions for 1.5 minutes before Petch came over and strung the tape. I counted them. I measured one with my own boot, holding my size 11 work boot against the edge of the impression in the soft mud. The impression was at least 6 inches longer than my boot at the toe and several inches wider across the ball. I didn't say anything to Petch. I don't know exactly why. Partly because I didn't have any language for it yet. Partly because Dale was being loaded onto a stretcher 20 meters away, and that was the only thing that mattered right then. Dale was in Hope Hospital for 11 days. I drove out to see him on the 4th day when they said he was clear-headed enough for visitors. He was propped up in a hospital bed in a room with 2 other men, one of whom was asleep and one of whom appeared to be watching a hockey game on a small television mounted near the ceiling. Dale looked wrong in a hospital bed in a way that some men do, too large and too still for the surroundings. His colour was coming back. His hands, which were resting on the blanket, had that particular roughness of a man who works with them in all weather. I asked him how he was doing, and he said fine, in the way that men from that generation use the word to mean a great many things other than fine. Then I asked him what he remembered. He looked at the window for a while. Not the hockey game, not me. The window. Then he said, I remember the truck going. I remember the creak. I remember getting the door open and getting halfway out before I understood I couldn't go anywhere. He stopped. He picked at a loose thread on the blanket. After that, he said, it's mostly dark. But I remember something large. I remember not being cold anymore when there was no reason not to be cold. And I remember something like being picked up, except not rough. Careful. He said that last word with a kind of deliberate weight, like he'd been thinking about which word was right and had settled on that one. Careful. Then he looked at me and said, I'm not going to talk about it again. And he didn't. I want to be clear about that. In 41 years, Dale never raised the subject again. Not with me, not with anyone in the family as far as I ever heard. He went back to work in the camps the following spring. He married a woman named Patricia in 1987, and they had 3 children, and he ran his own falling crew out of Williams Lake for the better part of 2 decades. He was alive and functional and present, and whatever he carried from that creek drainage he carried in the quiet way he carried most things, which is to say, you wouldn't have known it was there unless you already knew to look. I worked that stretch of highway for the first time in the spring of 1984, 6 months after the accident, when I took a maintenance posting out of the Hope Yard. BC Ministry of Transportation, Highway Maintenance Technician, which is a title that covers a considerable range of work: road grading, drainage clearing, sign installation, guardrail repair, slide debris removal after the winter. 33 years of it. The spur above the creek drainage wasn't in my regular maintenance rotation, it being a decommissioned logging access. But the section of number 3 below, it was. I drove that road 3 or 4 times a week in season for most of those 3 decades. A man who pays attention to ground, who has to read surfaces professionally, doesn't stop reading them when he's not on the clock. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. But I noticed things over the years. Small things mostly, the kind that you could explain away individually, and that taken all together still could be explained away, except that after a certain number of them, you stop reaching for the explanations quite as eagerly. The first time was in the spring of 1986. I was clearing a blocked culvert on the lower section of the number 3, about 200 meters below the old spur junction. Biscuit was in the truck, a blue-tick hound I'd had since she was 8 weeks old. Not a nervous dog by any measure, the kind of animal that sleeps through thunderstorms and regards most of the world with calm indifference. She sat up straight in the passenger seat and put her nose to the window glass and held herself absolutely still, not whining, not growling, just attending to something on the slope above the road, in a focused, almost formal way that I had not seen her do before. I stopped what I was doing and looked. I could see nothing in the tree line above the road, cut except the fir and the cedar and the shadow between them. After maybe 2 minutes, Biscuit sat back down and put her head on her paws and went back to sleep. I stood at the road edge and looked at the slope for another minute. Nothing moved. I told myself it was a black bear. That was the reasonable explanation, and it may well have been correct. Bears were common on that slope in spring. The second time was in the summer of 1991. I was doing guardrail inspection on the number 3 around the hairpin a half-mile below the spur junction, and I found something in the drainage ditch on the uphill side that stopped me. It was a pile of stones, 8 or 9 river rocks of the kind that come out of creek beds, stacked in a rough column about 18 inches high, sitting in the drainage ditch where no one had any obvious reason to stack them. The column was deliberate. There was no reading it otherwise. Each rock balanced on the one below with the kind of care that says someone took their time. I stood there long enough to feel foolish about standing there. Then I noted it in my field log as anomalous debris and moved on. I checked that stretch again 2 weeks later. The rocks were gone. I tried the rational explanation. Kids, maybe, or a surveyor with an odd habit, or one of those trail marker builders who turn up in remote places. None of them held together for long when I looked at the specific geography. That section of drainage ditch was not on any hiking route. There were no tire marks in the pullout that I hadn't put there myself that week. The third time I gave up trying to explain away was in the winter of 2003. I was doing a post-storm check on the number 3 after a wet snowfall had come down heavy on the upper elevations, and I stopped to examine a section of road cut where some material had slid onto the shoulder. The snow on the cleared shoulder was undisturbed except for one set of tracks, crossing from the upper timber to the lower edge of the road, heading down toward the creek drainage. Bipedal. The stride was long. Each impression was clean and deep in about 4 inches of settled snow, and I crouched beside one and looked at it for a long time. And I thought about Dale in the hospital room picking at the loose thread on his blanket and saying the word, careful. I didn't photograph it. I regret that. I don't have a good explanation for why I didn't. Partly, I think, because I was not ready for what a photograph would mean. It was one thing to register a fact quietly in your own chest. and another thing entirely to make the fact into an object you could show someone. I told Ruthie that evening. She listened without interrupting, which was characteristic of her. And when I finished, she said simply, "I know." She said she had known since the night Dale was found, when Constable Petch had mentioned the bow arrangement to my Uncle Warren on the telephone, and Warren had relayed it to her. She said she'd thought about what kind of creature, in that country, in that weather, would know to cut fir boughs and arrange them as insulation. She said the word creature without any apology, and she looked at me over the kitchen table with her steady brown eyes, and I understood that she had arrived at the same place I had, years ahead of me, and had been patient enough not to make a point of it. We made the promise that winter. We agreed we would not speak of it outside the family, and within the family, only to each other. Ruthie's reasoning was practical. She said, "Dale made his choice about this, and we don't have the right to undo it." She was correct. Dale had drawn a line around what happened to him on that slope, and he had the right to that line. Whatever I had seen or inferred, I had no business putting it in front of people who hadn't been asked to carry it. So I carried it instead, along every kilometre of the number 3 that I drove for 20 more years after that winter. Along the drainage and through the hairpin and past the old spur junction where the cut in the road bank had grown over with fireweed and young alder, but was still visible if you knew where to look. I'd slow down there every time, out of habit. Biscuit, riding shotgun on the days I took her along, would sometimes sit up straight as we came through that stretch and look at the timber the same formal way she had in 1986. I would look too. Usually there was nothing. Once, and only once, in the fall of 2011, I thought I saw something move in the heavy timber about 40 meters off the road, a dark shape in the shadow between 2 large cedars. There, and then not there. The light was going. I cannot tell you with certainty what I saw. I am telling you what I think I saw, and I am marking it plainly as my own interpretation, because that is the honest accounting. Ruthie got sick in the autumn of 2018. By February of 2019, it was clear the cancer was not going anywhere except forward, and by May, we were counting in weeks. She was 66 years old, and she faced the end of her life with the same equanimity she had applied to most other things, which is to say she organized it methodically and refused to perform distress for the benefit of others. She told our daughter where the important documents were. She made a list of people she wanted me to call after. She ate what she could, and she slept when she needed to, and she let me sit with her in the evenings, without requiring conversation. In her last week, she brought up Dale's accident twice. The first time she said, "I'm glad he's still alive." Just that, out of a long quiet. I agreed with her. The second time, the day before she died, she said what I told you at the beginning. "Glenn, when I'm gone, you tell it. You tell it right." I held her hand and I said I would. She closed her eyes, and I don't know if she was sleeping or just resting, but she didn't say anything more on the subject, and I didn't press her. There was nothing more to say. The promise was transferred. The obligation had found its new shape. I've been sitting with that for 5 years now. There is a particular weight that a kept secret accumulates over decades. It isn't painful, exactly. It's more like a stone you carry in your coat pocket. One you've carried long enough that you've stopped noticing it most of the time, but that you can always feel when you put your hand in there. After Ruthie died and the promise changed, I'd reach into that pocket and the stone was still there, but the reason for carrying it had shifted. It wasn't a secret I was keeping for Dale's sake anymore, or not only that. It was a thing I owed to the country itself, to the record of what happened in it, to the idea that something in those hills had chosen to be kind to a man it had no reason to help, And that act deserved to be said plainly by someone who had seen the evidence and understood what it meant. So let me say it plainly now. Dale Graham went off a logging spur road in the Fraser Canyon on the 23rd of October, 1983, and fell 30 feet into a creek drainage. He survived the impact with a fractured pelvis and 2 cracked ribs. He was found 60 meters from the wreck on the road shoulder, in a condition of organized warmth, covered in fresh-cut fir boughs, 2 days later. A man with a fractured pelvis cannot move 60 meters across broken terrain under his own power. A man who cannot move cannot cut fir boughs and arrange them over himself. The track impressions in the soft ground beside him were not made by any person or any animal that I, with 33 years of outdoor experience in that exact terrain, have ever seen produce that pattern. Whatever made those tracks also made the choice to carry a badly injured man up 30 feet of brushed hillside, place him on the road where searchers could find him, and cover him against a killing frost. There is no human agency that accounts for this. I've tried to find one for 41 years. I've failed. What Dale said in the hospital room I have turned over so many times that I know the texture of every word. Something large, not rough, careful. Those 3 things together, in a cold creek drainage, in the dark, from a man who was barely conscious and had no reason to say anything other than what he experienced. Dale Graham was one of the least fanciful people I have ever known. He told me those 3 things and never spoke of it again. And I think the reason he never spoke of it again was not that he doubted it, but that he had decided it was private, between him and whatever found him down there. I respect that. What I can add to Dale's 3 words is this. When I was standing on that road shoulder before Constable Petch strung his tape, looking at those impressions in the soft ground, I was aware of the trees. The drainage timber came up to within about 20 meters of the road at that point. The big second-growth Douglas fir and some older cedar, the kind of stand that doesn't let much light through even in October when things have thinned out. The tree line was absolutely still. No wind, no bird movement, none of the ambient rustle that a drainage forest normally carries. Still in the way that a room is still when someone has just left it and the air hasn't settled yet. I don't know if that means anything. I'm only telling you what I noticed. I want to tell you one more thing, and then I'll finish. In the 33 years I drove that section of highway, I never once felt threatened on that stretch. Not anxious, not watched in the way that makes the hair on your neck stand up. Watched, yes. I think I was watched on that road more times than I know. I think whatever moved through that drainage was aware of me in the way that creatures with long memories and patient habits are aware of things that come through their country regularly. But the awareness never once felt hostile. It felt, if I have to put a word to it, interested. The way a neighbor might watch someone they know walking past their property. Not suspicious, just attentive. Biscuit died in 2016, a few months past 14 years old, which is a good run for a blue tick. I buried her at the back of the property near the fence line where she used to sit in the summer evenings and look at the field. She was a good dog in all the ways that count, calm and loyal and honest, and she is the only other witness to most of what I've told you. She took her testimony with her, which seems right. I retired from the ministry in 2017 after 33 years. I haven't driven the number 3 regularly since, though I've gone through it a handful of times on the way to see Dale and Patricia in Williams Lake. Dale is 69 now, and his knees are going on him, and he runs the crew from the office more than the bush, and he still doesn't talk about October 1983. We talked about Ruthie at length when I went up last spring. We talked about his youngest grandchild, who is something like 4 years old and already interested in dogs. We sat on his porch and had coffee, and watched the afternoon come in off the mountains, and it was good and ordinary. and complete in the way that time with people you love is when you both understand there's less of it ahead than behind. I didn't bring up the drainage. He knows, I know. I know, he knows, I know. It lives between us the way certain true things do, acknowledged by the quality of the silence around them rather than by being spoken. Ruthie was right to release me from the promise. Not because the world needs to be told exactly, but because I needed to say it. Because Dale is alive, and he is alive on account of something in that country that chose to carry him out of it. And that fact has sat in my chest for 41 years, without anyone but Ruthie having the full weight of it. And that is a long time to hold something true by yourself. I don't know what it was. I have never used any particular name for it, not even in my own head, because the names that exist all feel too small or too wrong for what the evidence describes. What I know is what it did. It moved through a dangerous stretch of canyon terrain in the dark and the cold. It found a man that a coordinated official search effort had not found. It understood what that man needed in terms of warmth and protection. It had the means and the judgment and the strength to provide those things. And it placed him somewhere he could be reached and survived. It did all of this without any expectation of anything in return, as far as I can tell. And then it went back into the timber and left no account of itself except for the impressions in the soft ground that I measured with my size 11 work boot, and then watched Constable Petch photograph and never mention again in any public document. That is all I have to tell you, and it is the honest truth. I'm sitting at my kitchen table as I say this, the same table where Ruthie and I drank coffee for 32 years, where she told me she was releasing me from the promise with her voice, going quiet and steady. The chair across from me is empty. The window behind it looks out on the back field and the fence line where I buried Biscuit. And beyond that, the mountains are there the way they always are, indifferent and permanent and carrying whatever they carry in the timber and the drainage and the cold country above the roads. If you've ever stood at the edge of deep timber and felt something looking back, not with threat, but with a patience that predates everything you know, then you may understand something of what I've been carrying. I don't need you to believe me. I'm only asking you to hold it carefully, the way something careful held a broken man once and gave him back to the road.